All right, Mike, you wanna get started?
Yeah, let's get this puppy started. I'm actually captivated by the chat right now. It's so great to see people coming from all over the country and all over the world. So yeah, so welcome everyone. Today we're going to talk to you a little bit about pronunciation and this idea of sound scripting as a tool for improving pronunciation. But before we begin, we thought that we just maybe introduce ourselves. As well. What will you learn today? Well, essentially, you're going to look a little bit at these different aspects. We'll talk mostly about what we call the suprasegmentals of pronunciation. So not necessarily individual words, but rather aspects such as stress and intonation. And we're going to introduce actually a short activity that you can probably use tomorrow in your classes. So as always, whenever we design these workshops, we really want to make them user-friendly so that you can go home or return to your classroom and use these things right away. So we'll start off by just looking at what sound scripting means. Again, we'll focus on features beyond sounds and some of the suprasegmentals such as stress, intonation, and pausing. And we'll finish off with, again, going through a task together. So let's start with who we are. So Andrew, Leo, and myself are part of Learn Your English. We call ourselves the Learn Your English team, or the Three Amigos. And we started about, I guess, 2 years ago now. And again,
Crazy, I know.
5, yeah, because of Corona and everything. But we started off just as like-minded individuals, teachers who were passionate about professional development and passionate about just exploring and taking chances in our classroom pedagogically and really kind of pushing the limits of our own teaching. And the way we kind of do this is by exploring our knowledge of theory and seeing what's being done in research settings, but then also applying our own experience. And really, when we have these workshops, we really want you to do the same. We want you to think back in your own knowledge of what's out there in terms of theory and research, and also think about the choices you've made in the past in your own classrooms and how this workshop can then be kind of implanted or used in your current context. So one way that we kind of spread the message of this kind of three-pronged approach to professional development is through our teacher membership. Teacher membership is essentially a group of like-minded individuals who are passionate about teaching. We come together once a month, and we basically set 30-day challenges, and we bookend those challenges within workshops at the beginning of the month and workshops at the end of the month. And we have monthly check-in sessions as well, but typically they relate to a theme that comes from either our newsletter or our podcast. And we use these workshop sessions as well as our own independent reading time to really build a better understanding of these themes. And again, think about ways in which we can use them in our classroom. And throughout the process, we stay engaged with one another through our Facebook community and other additional workshops like this. And I know a fair few of our members are in the audience today. One other benefit is that we offer special discounts to our members as well on other courses we design. One recent course we've designed is this Teaching Listening Made Easy course, which we had honestly a lot of fun making. And I think the feedback has been great. But the great thing about these courses is that they all relate to the number 10, the teacher membership, the Teaching Listening Made Easy courses, as well as some of the other course offerings we have. And that number is important because we were recently accredited by TESOL Ontario. So if you do complete the Teaching Listening Made Easy course, you can actually get credit for 10 professional development hours now through TESOL Ontario. Not that we support the idea of doing things for stamps, But I think it is important that we let you know that we have become more recognized by some of our peers in Canada, and we're very grateful for that. And I think it shows that by engaging with us more, you'll also have the opportunity to also be rewarded and get those qualifications. The only other aspect that we do would involve our content. We do that two ways. One is through our syllabus and materials design, and the second one that we offer is, of course, our podcasting services. We have our own podcast, which is available to the public. We have one podcast for students and one podcast for teachers. But we also partner with other institutions and provide podcasting services for them. And if you are interested in partnering with us, then please always email us at info@learnyourenglish.com. Or you can go to our website and sign up as a partner or affiliate. And we'd very much like to help you out and work with you and find creative ways that we can move forward together, especially in this age of teacherpreneurship, given the fact that so many schools are closing, and it's now up to us as a teaching community to support one another with other professional endeavors. So really that's it. We're really pumped that you're here. I'm going to hand things over to Leo now because we're going to get started on the session. Really hope you enjoy it, and I'll be in the chat. So if you do have any questions about partnerships, just let me know.
Thank you, Mike. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, good. As Mike said, if you have any questions, even throughout the session, feel free to just type them into the chat box. Mike and Andrew are going to be looking at it. I have no access to the chat box while I'm presenting. But as Mike said, the session will have some checkpoints for us to reflect, for us to ask questions, and for us to design. So this is the map of our journey today. We're going to start by, go back here. We're going to start by looking at the current state of speaking and pronunciation. And one of the things that we really like to do is to problematize English language teaching. And of course, we're not just going to talk about a problem, we're going to offer a solution that we strongly believe that actually will make an impact or will have a positive effect in the teaching of languages, in this case, English, and in the classroom with your students. So we're going to move on to talk a little bit about what Soundscripting is, why we should be using Soundscripting. We will spend a little bit of time here talking and dealing with the theory, a little bit of suprasegmentals. If you're not familiar with this, don't worry, we're going to be talking a little bit about this. And eventually, we're going to get to the last two parts, which is the application of Soundscripting, as well as looking at it from a business perspective. If you are a business teacher, if you teach academic English, or if you have students, private students who need to communicate more effectively. So to get the ball rolling, we're going to start with a task. So I'm going to present you with a scenario here, and I want everyone to think about this. So imagine you're preparing your students for a presentation or an academic seminar or any other type of speaking activity. The fact is their accuracy is acceptable, but they're still struggling with sounding clear, sounding more interesting, sounding more fluent, and more importantly, having the listener follow along. So this is the scenario for us. What I want you guys to do, what I want everyone to do as we are going through this first task is to perhaps, I'm giving you two options. First, maybe think about a talk or a video or a listening activity that you have used recently, and perhaps talk about what you did in order to help your students speak more smoothly and more fluently. Again, assuming that the listening tasks have already been completed. Or if nobody has an idea or an activity, I'm going to show you a text which was produced by one of our students, and we can try to design a sequence that would help them with speaking more smoothly and fluently. So we're going to go into breakout rooms for approximately 5 minutes. Let me see if I can do that. I actually don't have, where are the breakout rooms here? There you go. All right. So we have 7 participants per room. That's a lot. So we're going to do about 4 to 5 people per room. I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes to think about the task. So I'm going to give instructions again because as teachers, we know that we're not very good at following instructions. So imagine this is the text that your students have produced or they're working with. How would you help them produce this in a way that would allow for better intelligibility, that would allow your students to sound more clear, to sound more interesting, and to sound more fluent? Okay, so 5 minutes, how would you approach this task? We're gonna go into breakout rooms right now.
All right. Hello. Hey, Sheila, how's it going?
Good, thanks. How are you?
Good, not too bad. Who else do we have here? Glynis is here.
I'm in
Hi.
pajamas. I'm sorry. I'm not turning my video on.
That is totally fine. Your voice is enough. Yes. And who else do we have here? Sorry, your name isn't on your screen, so I.
Can you
there
see
we
me?
Yes, we can see you.
Yeah? Okay. Can you hear me too? All right.
Geisa, is that?
Well, actually, I'm from Brazil, and
Okay.
my name is Geisa.
Geisa. Okay.
But everybody calls me Geisha.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you prefer? That's the more important thing.
Whatever.
Okay.
Whichever one.
All right. So my job is to listen here, really. So what do we think about that task? And did we remember what the text was? No? Okay.
No.
I will copy and paste it into the chat. But the task is to imagine that our student needs to say this, maybe to present this, let's say. So what can we do? What tasks can we activate in class in preparation to help them speak more clearly, efficiently, etc.?
I can't see the paragraph, but chunking would be one of the things that I would be doing. Yeah.
Okay. So the paragraph I just put into the chat, Glenn, so if you have access to the chat,
Right.
it's there. But chunking is a great example.
Oh, it's in the chat.
I just copied and pasted. It wasn't before. I just put it there
Okay.
now, just because we can't see the other screen from a breakout room. How would you go about that, Glynis? What would your instructions be, for example?
Well, part of it is in the breathing, is in the pauses, right? So in the days before advertising, there was word of mouth, right? So you're the phrasing and then the pausing and that slight and the lengthening of the breath between the sentences and shortening it in at the commas and then shortening it more when you've got just a chunk of language.
Okay, so noticing a couple of things, right? So commas are a common one, right? An obvious one. Two, comma jokes are funny, aren't they? Right? So commas, of course.
It's not just the punctuation, though. It's like the actual the phrases. So in this case, it wouldn't say it this way, but in the days before advertising, and in a sense, we do in the days before advertising, we still in the days we say it slightly faster, and then before advertising, the same sort of thing.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, so obviously, yeah, chunking a great example to start off for sure. Sheila, Geisa, what do we think?
Yes. Well, I do agree with Glynis, sorry. Glynis, sorry. The first thing that came to my mind was work on the pause. Okay. Actually, it was the only thing that I can say. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's a great thing. Don't apologize. Sheila, yeah.
I don't know if I have anything to add, actually, because I was thinking about chunking and yeah, just putting the
chunking
words
and pausing actually are
naturally
different.
go together. They work a bit on stress.
Okay, there's another good word.
Yes.
So what can we do with stress here? If we just read in your mind that first sentence naturally, what what words would be stressed and what words would not be stressed.
In the days before advertising,
Mm-hmm.
word of mouth.
And how do you think we know that? Because it's easier for us to do that, of course. How would we
Absolutely.
instruct
So how
our
do we-
students to
Yeah.
notice that, right?
There, yeah, well, that's why I'm here.
Okay, perfect.
To learn these things.
Like inda, right? Those are words that we shorten because they're function words as opposed to content words.
There
So
we go.
usually we focus, we stress the content words, and the function words we shorten them, you know, bring them together and that sort of thing. So, you know, in the days before advertising, and then within advertising, the syllables that we would stress, but it's still
It's a pretty good rule of thumb. Not
Yeah.
always true, of course, but I think that's a great place to start. And
Mhm.
if we're talking about features of connected speech, I mean, we're talking about speaking today, not so much listening comprehension, but again,
Okay.
generally speaking, not always, but what words get mushed together, what, you know, usually we're talking about function words getting mushed together or connected together, right? So bang on, that's a good suggestion,
Mhm.
Glynis. I don't want to give away all the answers because then we don't have to stay for the rest of the session, right? But a good place to start.
All right. I think we have everyone back. Okay, so this was the task. To those of you who have just joined us, the task was very simple. I presented everyone with a scenario. Again, you're preparing your students for a presentation, a seminar, any other type of speaking activity. Your students are very accurate. They can actually produce the target language accurately, but they're still struggling with sounding clear, with sounding more interesting, sounding more fluent, and even having the listener follow along. So we've thought about giving you something that a student has produced, and your task was to try to think about a sequence that you would use to help the student in this case, speak more smoothly and fluently. If you have any ideas, you can share them on the chat. We can talk a little bit about that before I start problematizing the current state of speaking and pronunciation. Do we have any ideas that anyone wants to share with us? You would use a tongue twister with this. Okay. I don't know how a tongue twister would help them here. It's also important to share your passion for this subject. Good. So Glennis said sharing your passion for the subject. Yes. Skills are cheap. Passion is priceless. Exposure to lots of speakers, maybe even dictation. Yeah. Okay.
We had a lot of good answers in my group, but I don't want to say them because I don't want to give too much away. But
Right.
if you were in the group I was in, you're on the right track.
Yeah. Well, Natalia said introducing the idea of thought groups, sentence, word stress, peak vowels. She's on the right track here. John said content versus function words. Yes. Which words get more emphasis? Yes. Yes. Bruno said a vocal warm up. Maybe. Yeah. That works. I think. I haven't done that with my students, but we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. So let's. Oh, Celeste said making them aware of connections between words. Yes, connected speech. Absolutely, absolutely. So let's problematize things a little bit because this is how we like to approach language education. So we're gonna look a little bit at the current state of speaking and pronunciation in language teaching. And again, I'm not here to criticize, but I think some of you will probably recognize these kinds of activities that you would find in most published materials. As you can see, right here we have a have you ever question. So again, have you ever activity is a very controlled activity where students just have to produce sentences using have you ever. We have another speaking activity here where students just have to basically answer questions. Moving on, something also very similar here, answering questions with the partner. And then there's a little bit of a task here whose life has changed more. You're still feeding a lot of language that you want students to produce. Same thing here. What do you think a ghostwriter is? Choosing definitions. Let's look at pronunciation now quickly. What do we have here in terms of pronunciation? Let's see. This is the syllabus from a textbook. I'm not going to mention which textbook, but you can see that pronunciation is somewhat disconnected from discourse. So here we have pronunciation being isolated. Here we have stress, again, isolated. Here we have emphatic stress, also isolated in all three examples. What is happening to my slides today? Having issues here. Okay, it's my mouse. Okay, so this is another example of pronunciation here. Again, focusing primarily at word and sentence stress. And again, not trying to criticize, but what do you notice about the stress words here? There's a lack of difference in terms of syllable stress. We're not really emphasizing that. Again, this idea of listening and repeating sentences. So again, we're working primarily at a word level or at a sentence level here. Let's look at another example here. Another textbook. This one doesn't even have pronunciation. This is a business textbook. Another example here of a speaking and pronunciation. We have two differences. Again, students have to talk about the differences between these two pictures. Remember to stress the things that you want to contrast. So again, relying not only on their explicit knowledge to do this, but also expecting them to not only communicate, but also remember to stress things. So you're asking a bit too much of students to do in a situation like this. And then here we have a good example, actually. This is from English for Life by Collins. And isolating the schwa sound, which is, we all know it's the most common sound in spoken English, having the students listen and repeat. Again, we're looking at phrases here, right? Again, we're either dealing with pronunciation at a word level, we're dealing with pronunciation at a phrase level, or we're dealing with pronunciation at a sentence level. Is there anything wrong with that? Absolutely not. No, there's nothing wrong with that. But again, the point is, and this is something that I'm borrowing from the Common European Framework of Reference for Language, which basically states that the main goal of language learning is to satisfy, and again, I'm emphasizing this, the communicative needs of the learners. Again, with the aim of enabling them to exchange information and ideas, and more importantly, communicate their thoughts and feelings. With that in mind, I'm going to give everyone a 30-second reflection check mark here. So I want you to reflect on your own design, on the design of your own lessons, on how you approach speaking, how you approach pronunciation, and how you approach presentations in your class. Are you still dealing with pronunciation, speaking, and presentations, especially when you want to focus on the message? Are you still dealing with language at a word level, at a phrase level, at a sentence level? I know not everyone is doing it that way, because some of the answers in the chat were very good, very related to what we were talking about here. Let's see. So yeah, I want you to reflect, maybe share your thoughts here on the chat before we move on to the next part. So what is soundscripting? It's a good question. So soundscripting, to those of you who are not familiar, is basically a technique that has been inspired by teleprompters and auto cue, which basically allows the presenters to read a script while maintaining direct eye contact with the audience. And because the speaker is never looking down to check on their written notes, he or she gives this appearance that they're actually speaking spontaneously. And again, what is good about this technique is that it doesn't really require much apart from a Microsoft Word document. And even that isn't really a requirement. I think the one person who brought examples of soundscripting into language teaching was Mark Powell back in 1996. Hard to believe that it's been almost 24 years now when he brought this idea of sound scripting. So why should we focus on sound scripting in the classroom? Well, there's a lot of reasons. First, sound scripting is really easy to be implemented, and it will definitely help learners improve their fluency, improve their accuracy, and improve their pronunciation. Why? Because they're focusing on lexes, they're focusing on language, they're focusing on prosodic features. And by that, I mean suprasegmental elements, chunking, length, stress, tone, intonation. What else? This tool is particularly useful for those students who are not very familiar with the notion of intonation for conveying importance and lengthening words, or lengthening of words, I should say. So what we are going to be doing here today is we're going to be looking at what sound scripting is, its advantages, and we're going to walk you through the steps before we can actually discuss how we can implement sound scripting in the classroom. One of the things that I didn't mention is that sound scripting is very much in line with self-directed learning. Why do I say this? Because once you have trained yourself to use sound scripting in your class, you can easily train your students to use sound scripting as well. And eventually they can actually go through the entire process of sound scripting by themselves. And I will show you examples of students of mine who have done a lot of work with sound scripting, and you will see that towards the end of our session. And finally, sound scripting also addresses the shortcomings of published materials. We all know that published materials have their flaws, so we hope that sound scripting will supplement some of those things. And as I said, it is a transferable skill. So, which brings us to the theory. So you're gonna have to bear with me for a little while here. I will try not to bore you to death with this. So we will not talk about segmentals, because I think everyone knows what the segmentals are. And this is actually the IPA chart. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Adrian Underhill is the one who put this forward in his book, Sound Foundations, I guess. I think that's the name of the book. Red cover. I think many of you probably remember that. So what are segmentals? Segmentals are basically individual sounds. We're looking at phonemes, vowels, consonants, and of course, diphthongs. But the problem is segmentals are overemphasized when we're teaching pronunciation. If you spend a little bit of time on Instagram, on YouTube, or even looking at textbooks, you will find that 99% of what people are dealing with on these social media platforms, what they're teaching students is basically segmentals. They're teaching them what's the difference between minimal pairs, like when they say, well, how to pronounce bitch, how to pronounce beach, you know, things like that. But that's not really the focus of sound scripting. Again, I'm not saying that segmentals are not important, but intelligibility should be the primary aim. If a student says, you know, oh, I forgot to get the sheet of paper or the sheet of paper, I think the context will help them. We don't believe that this is actually something really important. But with segmentals, there's something that we need to remember, is that we need to think about the kind of expectations that we're generating in our students. We can't expect students to achieve native-like proficiency. And at the same time, we don't want them to sound like a native speaker. We want them to sound like themselves in a foreign language. And for this reason, we need to focus more on intelligibility, which is something that I'm going to be talking about a little later tonight. Why are segmentals important? Because they lead to this idea of connected speech. When words, basically the word boundaries get together, they basically disappear sometimes they link, sometimes a sound changes. So there's different types of connected speech. But according to Thornbury back in 2016, he said that this emphasis on segmentals doesn't really play an important role in changing intelligibility. So what is the goal of pronunciation teaching then? I think that's a question I want everyone to reflect on. So if we're not focusing on sounds, on phonemes, on segmentals, what is the goal of pronunciation teaching in the classroom?
And I think, Leo, we could take it one step further. We could also say, what is the goal of pronunciation teaching in the classroom in an era where we're probably going to be interacting with more individuals who are speaking English as an additional language.
Or a lingua franca, right?
Or a lingua franca, right?
That's right.
We're not pushing, as Leo said, we're moving away from this idea of sounding right and having no accent, quote unquote, no accent towards comprehensibility. So any thoughts that come to mind? I think it's a great question, Leo. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think it's important for us to frame sound scripting and frame the way we look at language right here, because what we're trying to say is that the goal of sound scripting is not to actually change your accent, is not really to change the way you sound, not to make you lose your identity. The question is, what is the goal of pronunciation teaching for many of you who are attending this session today? And I would like to ask the same question to a lot of these Instagram celebrities and people who post these videos on social media, how to say this word in English or how to pronounce this sound in English. I think it's a genuine question. It's not a question out of contempt or anything. I genuinely want to know, what is the goal of pronunciation teaching in the classroom? As you said, Mike, when the majority of our students will be communicating with people who don't speak English as their first language.
So some great comments here in the chat. So about Glynis's kind of point was really interesting here. She's talking a little bit more about the message and less about how. So oh my gosh, the chat's moving so fast, I can't find it. But Glynis, oh yes, that your interlocutor focuses on what you are saying, not how you are saying it. So so yeah, there's less strain, I guess, is what she's kind of getting at on the listener, perhaps. And I think Sandra had a comment. She was quite quick to comment here. I believe the goal is to provide students with the tools they need to understand others in a better way, and probably to be understood by others in a better way. Yeah, no, these are great. These are great. I think what I'm hearing, Leo, is that that delivering the message in a meaningful way and enhancing meaning in the process is maybe a theme that we're seeing in some of these comments.
There's a comment from Natalia here, but pronunciation is actually about teaching phonemes, isn't it? Prosody is not included in pronunciation as far as I know. Well, that's the kind of the argument that we're trying to put forward here. So Abercrombie, not the designer, said that what standard of performance is pronunciation teaching expected to produce in the learner? That's a question that he posed back in 1949. I don't think he had an answer for that, but actually he did. He said that what most language learners need, no more, they don't need much. They just need, and I love how he phrased this, a comfortably intelligible pronunciation. And I think that is what we need to be emphasizing when we are teaching pronunciation, a comfortably intelligible pronunciation. Which brings us to the next question. How can we achieve this comfortably intelligible pronunciation? But he wasn't done there because he had more to say. He actually said, and by comfortably intelligible, he's basically meaning something that you can understand without a lot of effort on the part of the listener. And I don't know how many of you here teach exam preparation, but the IELTS exam, I think in the speaking rubrics, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the rubric for the speaking includes this. Someone is able, the speaker is understood with, poses no difficulty to the listener or something like that. Correct?
Yeah, so
to that extent.
It's kind of, yeah, it focuses a little bit on reducing the amount of strain on the listener, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's kind of framed in that lens, yeah. But you can see the rubrics are public.
Mm-hmm. Natalia is on fire here. She said something very true. The standards for teaching pronunciation and prosody are very low around the world. This is the real problem. I think to a certain extent, I think we're still focusing, because textbooks are still focusing on pronunciation at the word level, actually at the syllable level, at the word level, at the phrase level, and at a sentence level. I think this is why we're not really getting this comfortably intelligible pronunciation, because we're not looking at language in its natural habitat, which is discourse. Language is discourse. Language exists as texts, not so much as words, as phrases, or only as sentences. So which brings us to the next point here. We're going to be talking a little bit about suprasegmentals now. So again, what are they? They basically go beyond the sound, the phoneme. So we're dealing with the musical aspects of pronunciation here. More specifically, rhythm, stress, and intonation. We're also looking at tempo. Some of the prosodic features here include tempo, your loudness, and, as you know, we do podcasts, the quality of your voice. But what is of interest for us is less the speaker's intelligibility according to native speakers' standards, but how intelligible they are to other non-native speakers. Because a German businessman will normally communicate with a Japanese businessman. I actually have a lot of international students who tell me 99% of my communication is with other non-native speakers of the language. So for this reason, I think this is what Kelly was trying to say, is that suprasegmentals definitely do play a more important role in intelligibility in this case. So moving forward, let's see what we have next. So what we really need to be doing here is we need to adjust, we need to shift the focus from a native speaker standard to a non-native speaker standard. So our realistic goal then should be to produce language that is intelligible. And again, this is something, this research actually by Jennifer Jenkins has produced a lot of interesting features, something that she calls the phonological core, which are crucial in affecting intelligibility. And this core offers, I would argue, a more realistic goals for those language learners who need to be intelligible in international context. Not an accent that is intelligible or unintelligible. It is the speaker that is intelligible or unintelligible. And I would go as far as to say that successful communicators can actually make themselves intelligible despite having a strong accent. Why? Because they make use of communication strategies. They're able to recognize and repair whenever they notice there has been some sort of communication failure. So, moving forward here, let's talk about sound scripting now. So we're going to get to this. So we're almost getting to the important stuff here. So it's very important for us to take into consideration the fact that there is a difference between a spoken language and written language. If you have read the works of Dave Willis, he does talk a lot about this difference, this dichotomy of spoken language and written language. And he actually said something which is very true, which is we can't really be teaching the way we are teaching because a lot of the language that we are teaching is actually written. So we are teaching written English as spoken English. Whereas we know that there are certain things that are characteristic of spoken language, such as false starts, discourse markers, incomplete sentences, things like that. Vague language, right. So if you want to practice this, we strongly recommend that you deal with sound scripting, that you apply sound scripting to texts that are spoken, not written. So maybe a speech, a TED Talk, an extract from a podcast, what have you. So what's important is you just have to basically find a spoken text that you want to use and play with it. Mark it up with the sound scripting ideas that we're going to be outlining in this session, which brings us to the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse now. And these are the 4 things that we're going to be focusing on: stress, chunking, pacing, and intonation. I will spend about 5 minutes talking about each of them, and we're going to illustrate each with an example of an activity that we have designed for EAP, general English classes, but a lot of these activities could be implemented with exam prep and other things. I've actually used some of them with my IELTS students in the past. So let's look at all four. So we have stress, another word for stress would be articulation. We have chunking, another word for chunking, you could call it pausing. I don't like to use a lot of meta language with my students, so this is why I'm giving you both options here. Pacing or rhythm, if you prefer. And of course, intonation, I couldn't come up with a better way of saying that, but my students just say, Leo, it's the up and down of the language. I said, okay, that works. So let's work with the ups and downs of the language. So again, whatever works for you, whatever works for you. What's your take on shadowing? I'll get to that. I actually have done some work on shadowing, but I'll share that later today, Fernanda. Thanks for the question. So word stress, let's just talk a little bit about word stress here. What is it? Again, excuse me, it's this emphasis that we place on certain syllables by doing exactly a couple of things. We could increase the loudness, we can increase the length, or we can increase or emphasize our pitch. Normally, when we think about stress, we're looking at two different types of stress. We're looking at prominent stress or we're looking at unstressed syllables. But we also have in the literature, we have something that we call primary stress and secondary stress, depending, of course, on the words that we're using. But word stress is different from textbooks because textbooks, the syllables are not always marked. So keep in mind that we don't have to apply all of this, primary, secondary, stress, and stress. Each time we teach, I want you to judge your classes individually. Deal with this based on the students that you have. I'm not saying that this is how you should be doing things. I'm just illustrating what is out there in terms of stress. We also have word stress, again, looking at word level, but we also have sentence stress, which is basically patterns that occur over a whole discourse unit. Something that you can do, and this is something that I found recently reading more about stress is, and I think it was a research paper, and if I can't remember the name right now, just send me a message and I will try to remember the name of the author. But he said that it's very important to make stress visual. Why? By highlighting that, by creating bubbles. I don't know how you want to make that visual, but when you highlight word stress, you are helping students remember, because the brain basically is able to store and recall a word based on its shape. So with that in mind, we've designed an activity to try to illustrate, to try to provide an example of how we can make word stress, sentence stress more visual. And of course, sentence stress is important because the meaning changes. So a sentence like this could be, you could place the stress in many different words here, and the meaning would change in each of them. You can say, my older sister doesn't live with my football coach. My older sister doesn't live with my football coach. She lives with her, I don't know, with the handball coach, not the football coach. Anyway, I think everyone is familiar with that because textbooks have that. So here's an example of how we can make pronunciation a little bit visible. And as you can see, here we have a list of words from an EA pre-program that we were teaching. And as you can see, I think based on this lexical set, you can kind of guess the theme of the lesson, right? So what we really wanted our students to do is we wanted them to try to going back to what I said, highlighting the word stress to aid memory. So to help our students remember, to help them store the pronunciation of these words so they can recall them based on the shape. We don't have to do the activity right now. I know teachers love doing activities, doing sessions, but because of time, when we have a lot to cover, I will skip this, but I'll show you the answers. This is something that eventually we end up with. You can cut them up into strips of paper. You can do a running dictation. You can do whatever you want with this kind of activity. But again, the point is to highlight, to make pronunciation more visual. But Leo, we're still working with words. Yes, we're gonna get there. We're gonna get there. We're gonna get from word to sentence to discourse. Another thing that we like to do is this idea of, again, if you're not in our reading for professional development, you probably won't know this, but we like to create activities based on 3 learning processes: noticing, categorizing, and exploration. So when students have to notice features of the language, then they have to categorize, which is what we call hypothesis building, and then they have to explore. They have to take risks based on the hypothesis that they have built. So a good example of making pronunciation a little more memorable is to help students understand patterns. So for example, in a situation like this, we give our students 12 words and we ask them to highlight the part of each word which has the strongest stress. Well, I think you can type the answer in the chat if you want to give this a try. I think we all know. They all have something in common, right? So the follow-up to this was, where does the stress come in words ending with these suffixes here? Can you try to think of any similar words that follow the same pattern? So the idea here is we can try to apply some not only noticing, hypothesis building, but just some sort of generalization, some rules that would help guide our students. Because if a student is able to notice patterns, he is more likely to remember the pronunciation of certain things. So instead of teaching the pronunciation of the word presentation, why don't you just teach them all the words that finish with the same suffix and see if they're able to identify the pattern here? The same thing with words. So the fact of the matter is they all have the same pattern. So right here, we're killing 2 birds, or maybe 3 or 4, with only 1 pronunciation stone. So sentence stress, let's talk about this. So when it comes to sentence stress, it's really important for us to remember this, that stress usually, it tends to come at the end of feeding 2 birds with a scone, don't kill them, right? Okay, so stress tends to come at the end of each chunk. And oops, my mouse, okay. And normally what we do is we can deliberately place the stress at the beginning or in the middle of a chunk. But when we do that, we can make changes to the meaning. So here's an example of a similar task that plays with that. So as you can see, I'm giving you some more context. I am moving away from working with pronunciation at a sentence level. We have more context here. So your task, this one I'm going to ask everyone to do. Your task is very simple. Which word in 1A and which word in 1B would be highlighted, would be stressed? The same thing for number 2 and number 3. Does it change? Why does it change? Again, encourage noticing, encourage hypothesis building. So this is the kind of activity that makes pronunciation more memorable. I'm going to wait for everyone to write the answers before I give you the answers. So number 1 here, somebody said number 1, that letter number 1A. Never. Are you sure about that? The British will never agree to that, but the Germans might.
Are you sure about that?
I don't know. So let's see what we have for number 1 here. So for number 1, we would have the British, because we're contrasting with the Germans. And in number 2, the British will never agree to that, not in a million years. Again, just to emphasize this, the point is to move away from just teaching pronunciation at a sentence level and try to incorporate a little bit more of context. So something that I have done with my students, and I don't know if I can do this, but I'm going to try. What I would do is I would give them the same sentence and I would ask them to try, and this is a hard one, to try to come up with the sentence that would follow. So if I say the British will never agree to that, what would be the follow-up sentence here? Or the British will never agree to do that. What would be the follow-up sentence? Again, this kind of activity can be modified, can be adjusted depending on the level of your students. So if you're dealing with a higher level class, I think you can definitely do something like this. Let's go to number 2. I'll just give you the answers. There are 3 points I would like to make, and all 3 concern prosody. There are 3 points I'd like to make, and then I'll hand you over to Andrew. Again, same idea, moving away from one sentence, moving away from this. Again, I would say it's the pronunciation McNuggets. I know Thornbury talks a lot about grammar McNuggets. I think pronunciation is dealt with in the same way that grammar is being dealt with in a lot of published materials. So let's move on to talk a little bit about chunking. So chunking, another way of explaining what chunking is basically how we package information for the listener. And we can package this information in thought groups. And again, the idea is simple. We're basically dividing our speech into chunks. Sometimes you can divide them into single words, or sometimes you can group them together. But again, the focus for us here is how we can communicate these thoughts and these ideas by emphasizing what is really important. So teaching students to read a text or a spoken text and ask them to find out what really is important here, what the speaker was trying to emphasize in this very specific message. And the reason why we do this is because we don't want to overwhelm our listeners with too much information. So, Leo, this is all great, but how do I focus on that in the classroom? We're going to get to an example right now. So I'm going to ask everyone to use the chat box for this one. So 2 examples of the same spoken discourse. Which one do you think a listener would understand better? Number 1. And by the way, this means the end of a thought group. So anyone can become a successful manager, but of course the unprepared, the untrained, and those given too much responsibility before. You get it. You get it. This is version 1. This is how this specific text was broken down into thought groups. And here's version 2. I guess the answer is quite obvious. And as you can see, we also have primary stress here. Anyone can become a successful manager. But of course, the unprepared, the untrained, and those given too much responsibility before they're ready will fail. That's what this morning presentation is all about. So teaching students to do this kind of chunking, to basically package information and decide where they want to pause, where they want to emphasize their message. I think this is something that we overlook in the classroom. So why chunking? Why should we be chunking more? Well, as I said, our ability to speak, to present information in these comprehensible chunks is by far the most important skill learners need to acquire. Not so much pronunciation at a word or sentence level. And this applies to both productive and receptive skills. What do I mean by that? Very simple. Language, specifically English, is divided into topic, comment. So when a student is able to understand that the topic of a sentence is actually 99% of the time, the topic of a sentence will always be a noun phrase, it will become much easier for him to actually chunk that information and pay attention to what comes next. The organization of a sentence in English is normally noun phrase plus verb. What comes after the verb really depends on the verb that we are using, but we'll get to that. And this is something that Mark Powell had to say in one of his talks, and I was lucky enough to actually watch this. And he said that in speech, if you have not thought ahead to the end of the chunk, you cannot get your stress or intonation right. This ability to speak in comprehensible chunks, according to Powell, or sound chunks as he calls them, is essential. So how can we make chunking? How can we explore chunking in the classroom? Again, we're going to go back to those 3 learning processes. The first one being recognition. Students have to listen and recognize where the speaker is ending his or her thought groups. The second thing we need to do is our students need to learn how to categorize. Why did he decide to pause here? Did he decide to keep going here? Why didn't he pause in this area? And then, of course, after that, we have to provide them with opportunities to actually explore all these hypotheses by testing them out. So I don't know how many of you have downloaded our English Mania lesson. It's free on our website. You just have to go to www.learnyourenglish.net.com and you can go there into the store and you can download this lesson for free. But there's an example, there's an excerpt that we use quite a lot in our lessons, and it's this. He is talking a little bit about English Mania. So what I have done with my students in the past is, first we would transcribe this whole passage. So we would do a little bit of bottom-up work here. Once they have transcribed the whole thing, of course, we're going to use this for chunking. So I'll give everyone 10 seconds to just read. And perhaps as you are reading, think about where you would chunk, where you would divide your thought groups here. Would you say, so is English Mania good or bad? Or would you say, so is English Mania good or bad? So right there, we're actually playing, we're making pronunciation more physical, okay? So how do we do this? Well, we have, again, we said Soundscripting is a framework, is a tool. You can train your students to do this. So let's look at, So one thing I usually like to do with my students, and Andrew and Mike will agree with me, is we ask the students to give it a try first, try it out. So we give them the extract and we have them read and record themselves as if they were presenting that. Then we play back the recording and we have them compare. How does it sound? What problems did you have? Who sounds more fluent? And then they can notice the gap, because language teaching should always be about identifying gaps in your production, in your output. When a student is able to listen to his recording and then compare that to the original and find out where the pauses are, I think we're promoting more self-directed learning, as opposed to us telling them how they should sound. And again, they don't have to copy exactly how that speaker produces language, but it will give them a very good idea as to where they can pause. So the third thing we would do is we would ask our students to mark pauses. Again, the way I do this, I choose 1 for very short pauses and 2 backslashes for longer pauses. And then once they have done that, I ask them to listen again and either bold or highlight the words that were stressed in each of those thought groups. And then I would have them record themselves reading the extract a second time. Now they have 2 comparison points. They have their first try and they have the second try with the Soundscripting. So I'm going to give you an example now of how we do this. So this is the first thing we do with pauses. So students they're basically marking the pauses. As you can see in the first part of this presentation, he didn't say so. So in this case, would it be possible to say that so wasn't really a discourse marker here in this case? Perhaps not. So these are the things you can always explore with your students. So is English Mania good or bad? Is English a tsunami washing away other languages? Not likely. English is the world's second language. It also teaches students to actually sound more fluent, because they know that they have to pronounce this as one thought group. But again, can you pronounce this in a different way without losing fluency? These are things that you can use with your students, and you can exploit these as well. The second thing we do, we focus on stressed words. So which words are stressed in this first thought group? So here, a lot of students will notice So is English mania. So is English. So it doesn't even sound like they're pronouncing, or he is pronouncing so is. It's so is English mania good or bad? Or so is English mania good or bad? Things like that. Is English a tsunami washing away other language, and things like that. So they mark the pauses, they mark the stress, and then if you want, depending on the level of your students, you could end there, or you could say, you know what, let's focus on primary stress. Because in the talk, he actually emphasizes, so is English mania good or bad? He actually does that. So is English a tsunami? He actually overpronounces that word. For effect, why does he stress the word tsunami here? Why is the word tsunami overly pronounced here? Because he's trying to create some sort of effect with the word washing away other languages. And that's it. You can, oops, let me go back here. And another thing you can do, again, this idea of getting students to really notice patterns of pronunciation is ask your students to notice how the stress words tend to be nouns and verbs. And I think it was John who said this at the beginning. Yes, mostly nouns and verbs, content words are usually stressed, as opposed to content words, to function words or grammar words, which are almost always never stressed. And something that I always ask my students to do is notice how it's also better to pause after stressed words, as opposed to pausing after words that are not stressed. So by highlighting these two points, I think what we're trying to do is we're really trying to encourage more noticing, more categorization, and again, making pronunciation not only visual, but also more intuitive by getting them to notice these features. So, which brings us to the last horsemen of the apocalypse. Actually, we have two more. Pacing. So let's talk a little bit about pacing here. I'm going to go faster now. So according to Thornbury, pacing is basically the way or the emphasis that some words have in order to give these regular beats, this 1, 2, 3, 4 that we have in English. And you can achieve this regularity in two primary ways. First, by stressing some syllables, and secondly, by lengthening or shortening intervening syllables. A very good example of this would be this nursery rhyme here. I guess it's a nursery rhyme. If I'd known you were coming, I'd have baked a cake. Or is it a song? I think it's a nursery rhyme. But this pattern of strong, weak, long, short, that's what really gives the language its rhythm. And again, we can achieve equal length to each foot, again, the words between each bar, so they can occupy the same length of time. Known, coming, baked a cake. If I'd known you were coming, I'd have baked a cake. If I'd known you were coming, I'd have baked a cake. So you would always have this pattern. And normally what happens with pacing, with rhythm, is that a lot of the times syllables get squeezed, and that's what creates difficulties in listening, because what we need to do is we need to accommodate, and that's what we do naturally in English. And how do we accommodate in English? Simple. We basically squeeze them, and rhythm basically interacts with stress and intonation so as to organize speech into meaningful units. So basically words and syllables are given prominence by rhythm, but they also tend to be the ones who are carrying the burden of meaning. So rhythm really helps listeners process a message easily. So let's look at a task here. How can we deal with pacing in the classroom? Again, I really like the idea of having students visualize, but also play with the language. So in this example, I would give them 3 ways in which I could perhaps pace these sentences, and I would ask them to play with them and tell me which of these doesn't really work. We can do the first one. So we have the person who never made a mistake never made anything. Okay, that works. The person who never made a mistake never made anything. Oh, that's powerful. That's like a Mandela speech. The person who never made a mistake, never made anything. Does that work? Not really. So again, a very simple noticing task that you can use with your students is to ask them, and again, you don't have, if you're working with a lower level, you can easily give them the options. But if you are working with a much higher level, my suggestion is give them one sentence, like the person who never made a mistake, never made anything, and ask them, how many different ways can you break this down so it sounds different each time you pronounce it? Okay, let's move on. So yeah, oh yeah, present the following to your group, experiment with changing the pace. So this is something that I do a lot with students. How can you change the pace of these sentences? This has never ever happened before. This has never ever happened before. I mean, there's many different ways you can say this. So have your students experiment. That's the exploration. They have already noticed, they have already built hypotheses. Now have them experiment, have them play with the language. Okay, so this is an example of what you can do. Finally, we're getting into intonation now. So intonation is basically, or can be simply put as the music of speech. In other words, John Field, actually, who we used a lot of his research to create our Teaching Listening Made Easy course, he actually describes intonation as a very meaningful use that speakers make of changes in their voice pitch. And again, also a suprasegmental feature in part of whole stretches of discourse. And intonation is also linked to stress and pacing. Again, they're all part of this prosody of speech, or the four horsemen of pronunciation. And to get a little bit too technical here, I don't want to go too deep into this, but we have what we call tone units, which, or some people like to call it a tone group, which is the basic unit of information, or some, in the literature, they also call this the nucleus. So the nucleus is nothing more than the most prominent syllable in a tone unit. And that specific tone unit can have some major changes in pitch. And these changes are what my students like to call the ups and downs of English, or rising pronunciation and falling pronunciation. So here's an example of how you can make this more visual. It's not what you know, it's who you know. So this is an example of how you can make intonation a little more visual. And I think, I don't know if I haven't seen a textbook that deals with pronunciation in this way. So why should we be focusing on intonation? Well, we all know this, that speaking is much more than simply passing on information. It also involves interpretation. It also showing the list. You also have to show to the listeners that you know exactly what they mean, and you have to add significance. You have to add more meaning to things. And that's the beauty of intonation, because this rising and falling is usually what tells the audience what you are thinking. I remember a Japanese student that I had a while ago, and he struggled with intonation because he never knew exactly when it was his turn to chime in into a conversation, to jump into a conversation. But I told him, you just have to really pay attention to the intonation. When our intonation falls, that means you're giving away the floor so you can actually take over and say something. Intonation is also important in terms of grammatical functions, especially with statements and questions, depending, of course, on the types of questions that you're dealing with. It also helps us with attitude. Those of you who are listening to us, we're watching this webinar tonight, a lot of exams, IELTS, I think to a certain extent, and CELPIP does a lot of that. There's a lot of understanding the attitudes of the speaker. And the only way for us to truly come to terms with attitude, for us to truly understand attitude, is we need to understand intonation. When our intonation means interest, when it means surprises, when it means that we are bored. And it also has a discursive function. And this discursive function is something that we actually looked when we were talking about stress back there, when we are contrasting new information with given information. So how can we make intonation more physical, more visible in the classroom? Here's one example. Again, a noticing task. What I would ask students to do, ask them to say these pairs of sentences aloud, but ask them to pause slightly where the mark is and see if they can understand the differences in meaning between each. So we'll look at number 2 here. I didn't marry him because of his looks. I didn't marry him because of his looks. So how does the meaning here change? So making this physical, making this visible, and encouraging students to play with the pitch, to understand what happens to the pitch of your voice just before each pause. I think it's something that we're not really highlighting much in published materials. And again, I'm not saying that this is true of every practitioner. I'm just saying that this is the problem that we have encountered with a lot of EAP classes, general English classes over the last 20, 30 years of our experience. Oops. I'm having issues with my slides for some reason. I think it's my mouse. So how can we, so now we're gonna put this all together. So I'm gonna show you a task, and let's think about how you would approach this using Soundscripting. So the words that are bolded are the lexis that students had to master for that specific unit that we were dealing with. And I think it was a unit on sustainability. So what would be the first step here? What would you, this is a spoken text, once again. What would be the first thing that we would do here? Would you start with word stress? Would you start with chunking? Would you ask your students to first record themselves and then listen? And Natalia said pauses markup. Yeah, you could start with that. Analyze word stress pattern. Yes. Yes. Glennis said listen to the presenter. Again, I like to take a task-based approach to things where I want my students to notice the gap. So what I would probably do first is I would ask them to look at this, and I would say, I want you to record yourself reading this, because I want them to understand the importance of sound scripting. Denny says, I've seen this text before somewhere. Yes, they probably took it away. They probably used it in their curriculum without our permission, Danny. No comments. Fernanda said, I would remove all the commas to make it more challenging. You could do that depending on the level. But commas are reading speed bumps, apparently. That's something that I read recently. Anyway, so what we could do here first, some of you have said this, you could focus on word stress. But this is what we did. We actually were trying to visualize, we're trying to help them remember the sound by giving them the shape. So once they did that first activity that we've looked at, we would give it to them and see if they were able to read the same text again, but this time just remembering the shape of the sounds. So sustainability is a global concept which can be summarized with the help of a 3-pillar model based on environmental, economic, and social pillars, I guess. Anyway, so that's the first thing we would do.
I think so.
Yeah? Okay, I don't remember this.
Maybe.
But anyway.
It sounds right.
Well, we designed this together. I remember this activity.
I do.
So the second step, you could chunk, as Natalia said, but now we added a challenge. So now they have the word stress, and they have to mark the pauses. They have to chunk it. The third step is the pace. They would have to mark the pace. They would have to mark the rhythm. Which words have a primary stress? Sustainability is a global concept which can be summarized with the help of a 3-pillar model based on environmental, economic, and social pillars. I think that's how it goes. Anyway, but that's what we would do. And if you think we're done, No, you could, oh, sorry. The fourth one would be intonation. So we would, I couldn't put the arrows there, but you would ask your students to try to mark the intonation in each of these thought groups. And that's basically how we would do this. And then, of course, we are very strong proponents of using their phones in the classroom. Have your students record themselves reading it the first time without sound scripting it, and reading it a second time sound scripting it, so they can notice the difference. And I think that's the important thing. And Andrew likes to say this a lot. Oh God, my computer today. We need to do more revisiting. We need to revisit everything that we do in the classroom. If they've done it for the first time, make sure they do it a second time, but this time with the sound scripting. Which brings us to sound scripting and presentation. So if you're teaching business English, if you're teaching CELPIP, if you're teaching IELTS exam prep, I think there is room for sound scripting there. This is an example of, I was teaching a B1, a very low pre-intermediate academic English class. And this is, my students were preparing just their presentations, just the introduction to their presentations. And I asked them to write what they are going to say, but then I asked them to simply, this was a very low level class, so all I wanted them to do was to focus on pausing. So this is what the student did. Good morning, my name is Latif. My purpose today is to talk to you about online business. As you can see, he tried to mark all the pauses here. And again, something that you can do as a teacher is you can ask them to record this, and then you can record yourself doing the same thing and see if they're able to notice the difference. I actually have a little bonus here for everyone. It's a video. I don't know if we're going to be able to hear it. I'm going to try. I'm only going to play the first 40 seconds. This is a student. This is the second time she presented. I don't have the video of the first time. I couldn't add it here, but this is her sound scripting live. Andrew, let me know if people can hear me. I can hear the audio here.
Not yet, no.
It's very low. Hold on, I think I need to do,
Did you share the audio when you shared the screen?
Yes, that's what I'm gonna have to do. I'm gonna stop sharing. And I'm gonna share again.
The wonderful world of Zoom, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Now I can hear it.
Can you?
Yeah. It's low, but it's there.
Yeah, we didn't have a good microphone in class, but let me go back a little bit here.
My purpose today is to explain to you about
That's okay.
organ donation. And many people know what organ donation is, but some people don't know the importance of being a donor. Today, I quickly describe what organ donation is. This topic is divided into 4 main parts. The first is, first I will explain what organ donation is. Second, I like to show you some statistics. Then I will be talking about some problems and solutions for this topic. Now,
she's a little nervous, as you can see.
Actually, Glennis had a pretty good observation there. I'd never noticed that before. I've seen this video many times, but she said that her body language, like her movements, is supporting her intonation, her sound scripting, which I never noticed that before, and she's right.
Glennis, if you want to learn more about that, I remember reading an article about embodiment in pronunciation. So I think something that people, and I think this is very common of Latin speakers of English, they really, because I communicate a lot with my hands, but I think with embodiment, what you're doing is you're using your body to support your spoken production. So if you do a little bit of research on, Andrew, you don't remember that guy who basically taught grammar just through body language? It was a presentation of a French guy, at that conference that we went to in Barcelona.
Yes, I do remember. That was cool.
Can you pull that video and share with people on YouTube? Do you remember that? It's
I mean, I can Google it, I guess.
Just Google it.
I can try.
Okay, so
body language French guy.
Body language, okay. French guy, grammar. He teaches the present perfect through embodiment. So reaching the end of our presentation so we can have a little bit of Q&A. So fluent speaking, in our view, in our opinion, is really not about speaking swiftly, but about speaking smoothly in measured phrases. Also, my computer today. Pausing in the wrong places definitely will frustrate listeners, whereas pausing in the right places will definitely give listeners the ability to process the message easily. And of course, with Soundscripting, we are really helping learners to understand, and now I'm going to borrow what Glenn said, and embody pronunciation so they can actually have a much clearer speech, easy for people to listen to, again, because they are relying more specifically on what we call effective lexical chunking. So I'm going to go back to the question that I posed at the beginning of our session today. What is the goal of pronunciation teaching? I know Abercrombie is 1949, so I was like, I need to find someone who had said something similar that is a little less outdated, I should say. And I came up with these two fellas here, Levi's and Lavelle, who said that the goal of pronunciation pedagogy is to really help learners achieve a comfortably intelligible pronunciation rather than a native-like one. So sounding like a native speaker should not be the goal of pronunciation teaching. The goal of pronunciation teaching should always be comfortably, intelligible pronunciation. Thank you very much. Oh, and some references here as well.
There's a couple of questions here in the chat, Leo. I don't know if you saw them.
Let's talk about that.
Celeste is asking, aside from, basically she's asking, so there's the general rules about when we should pause, but if we get more into the nitty gritty, of course, it's kind of up to the speaker in certain contexts, right? So how do we pass that on to our students?
It's what I have done with my students is training them. I have trained them to simply just mark pauses and then focusing on content words. With more advanced students, if you want, you can actually focus on aspects of connected speech. And I agree with you, Celeste. I think it's the decision to chunk is really it's really up to the speaker. It's not really up to me. It's not really up to the student. It's based on the effect that they want to have on their audience. So the general guidelines, Celeste, I honestly think that the best kind of guideline would be to train them to use Soundscripting more. I have Japanese students, I have Spanish students, I have a couple of Brazilian students, and I have a few Chinese students, and I have trained them all to actually use Soundscripting. And honestly, I very rarely spend time teaching pronunciation in class. Whenever we do a little bit of listening, I always ask them, can you pick one passage from this listening that was really meaningful to you, that really spoke to you? And I said, now I want you to think about, if you were this presenter, how would you present that? So that's one way of personalizing Soundscripting. You could say, let's do it the way the speaker did it, but now let's think about how we could do this in a different way. So I think, I really hope I answered your question by saying that.
I was going to add, it's in conjunction with models, right? Listening to other speakers talk, and if it's around the same topic or people making the same point, you can see, or they can notice how differently, how you would say one thing and how I would probably say the same thing, maybe a little bit differently.
Yeah.
And then incorporating a little bit of both maybe into their own speech.
Like, for example, even a quote like this: a generally accepted goal of pronunciation pedagogy is to help learners achieve a comfortably, like, you can chunk this in so many different ways.
Just on top of my head, like my question to my class would be, what is your most important idea in that section? And then those would be the words that you're going to probably stress or emphasize, right? Because it could be accepted for example, instead of goal. So
yes,
um,
we have a
Natalia-
skinny version, Celeste, that we can share with people as well. Yeah.
Natalia's also asking about disruptive pausing versus standard sounding pausing. I think that means disruptive, meaning it stops us from listening to somebody in a negative way. Natalia, hopefully I'm understanding that correctly.
Is there a way to change disruptive pausing to more standard sounding pausing? Yes, pausing in the wrong places. I like doing that, Natalia. I actually like giving my students, I've done this before where I recorded myself dictating a short text. And in one, I did what you call disruptive pausing, or just bad pausing in general. In one where there's better pausing, and then I would have them compare the two and say which one is better. A good example of disruptive pausing would be when you type in a text into Google Google Translator and you click on the sound button. I think you would get an example of disruptive pausing right there. But I think with sound scripting, some students have been because they're fluent. Yes, but Natalia, what I've noticed is, especially with a lot of my Asian students, and is that they were actually able to have gains in their fluency because they've learned how to chunk better. They've learned how to pause better, and I find that they come from a language where I think that doesn't really exist, or maybe if it does, I don't really notice when they're speaking their language. So
this is like the inversion of
sound scripting.
Sorry, the inversion of how we teach academic writing, right? We don't teach them grammar, but their grammar improves by teaching them structure and chunking with phrases, and then by using those phrases, their grammar gets better because that's just how it works. And it's the same thing with speaking. By chunking, their fluency in general improves because they're doing it. And this is not something, Leo, you're right, like I've done this, you've done this. This is something that we usually say you have to train students and it takes a long time. This is something in my experience that doesn't usually take a long time. A couple of classes and they've usually got it. It's a lot more accelerated of a process.
Fernanda asked a good question here. What do I think about shadowing? Actually, shadowing is supported by research. I don't remember who wrote. I think her last name is Hamada. But shadowing is an active and highly cognitive technique for EFL listening skills development, where basically the learners are tracking heard speech and vocalizing it simultaneously until it gradually becomes recognized. Having said that, there are a lot of other mysteries and misunderstandings about it. I think a lot of the problem with shadowing is that it's a separate technique from other similar techniques, such as elicited imitation, mirroring, simple repetition. And again, I'm not saying that shadowing is bad, but I think the difference between shadowing and sound scripting is that sound scripting really gives more to learners than shadowing. And I don't remember exactly what the paper said, but just off the top of my head, I think it's effective in improving learners' bottom-up listening skills. There is a lot of literature on the importance of shadowing in developing students' bottom-up skills. But with sound scripting, what I have noticed with my students, yes, I agree, Natalia. There has to be a lot of shadowing. And to be very honest with you, I don't know how much shadowing students want to be doing. With sound scripting, you're actually teaching them something, as I said, that is transferable, but it's something that they can actually apply when they are designing their own presentations, when they are speaking. And I think the results that I have collected over the last 5 years of my teaching experience with sound scripting is that students sound way better when in comparison to how they sound at the beginning of our sessions. So usually what I do, I try to get my students to record their presentations in the first week, and then do the same thing at the end of the session. And normally they can see that the difference is noticeable.
I think here too is with Soundscripting, at least the way that we do it, is the students are using their own writing, for lack of a better term, because they're creating their own presentations or seminars or whatever speaking activity that we're doing task in class, using, you know, TED Talks or other listening text as models, but there's more buy-in from them because they're doing it themselves, and it's their own words and it's their own story, to borrow from Glynis's analogy. So I think there's more autonomy and transferability in that.
I think that if you really spend more time, if you encourage your students to spend more time doing sound scripting for themselves, I think you would start noticing tremendous improvement, tremendous gains in terms of their production of language. The other thing, I was thinking about shadowing. I think one of the shortcomings of shadowing is that it's very difficult for a student whose first language is completely different from English to repeat what one hears simultaneously as accurately as possible, right? So like, what would you do when you want to hum a song that you're not familiar with, right? So you'd probably try to sing with the singer, but technically you're not singing with the singer, but you're following the singer with a slight delay. So it's almost like you can still shadow it, but with sound scripting, you were actually making something that is normally invisible more visible and more physical and more explicit. So you're making the invisible more visible, the implicit more explicit. So again, I'm not against shadowing. I would say, again, going on a limb here, but to say this, but I think shadowing is an aspect of the audiolingual approach, this repetitive technique. So yeah. Any more questions? Do we have any more questions?
I wanted to add too, because we were talking about student presentations, but it doesn't have to be presentations that we can use this in. We've done this in EAP context with seminars or small group discussions. We don't like the word debate, but meaningful discussions or conversations like that. Anything where they would prepare an opening, for example, that can work. Yeah,
I use a lot of with business students who have to do meetings, who have to start meetings, presentations, and things like that. I find that when they're able to
elevator pitch, right?
Elevator pitch is really good. So if you're doing that with elevator pitches, Danny already has a lesson plan prepared for tomorrow. We did that with seminar presentations, and actually, as a matter of fact, I compared two groups of students. I taught two groups of students. This year, I should have said recently, but it's not really that recent. I think it was one group in December and one in February. And I noticed that in one group, I did presentations without sound scripting, and the other group I did presentations with sound scripting. And the difference was, and they were at the same level, but the difference was huge. What else did we use? So something that I also encourage students to do is when they're listening and they're doing all the decoding work for themselves, and say, okay, now that you've decoded this entire stretch of spoken language, sound script it for me now, and then record yourself and then send it to me, and I'll give you some feedback. So I strongly recommend using sound scripting. I am the kind of person who I particularly, this is me speaking for myself, not Andrew or Learn Your English, I don't believe in explicit teaching of sounds. I have not seen a lot of improvement with students with me just simply teaching how to pronounce this word, how to pronounce that word. I don't see a lot of gains there, especially, and here's my argument, because I'm not just going to say this to you without having a support for my opinion here. When you teach the pronunciation of an isolated word, the sound shape of that word will change the moment that word is pronounced in context. A good example of this would be the word, I was teaching a Japanese student, was the word sedentary. And my student heard sudden interior many times. Why? Because that word, in that specific context, the word wasn't given prominence. So the word wasn't because I think the word was, oh yeah, she's got a sedentary lifestyle. But when you pronounce the word sedentary in isolation, we pronounce it like what we call the dictionary pronunciation, sedentary, or if you're British, sedentary. But when you hear that in spoken English, it never sounds like sedentary. Oh yeah, actually, since everyone is still here, I might as well share my screen here and share something with you.
I was going to say the sedentary is a very academic word, perhaps, but even with simple words, right? The word "but."
I would disagree.
I would
disagree. I don't think sedentary is an academic word. I think it's because it's a Latin word, right, Andrew? Sedentario, sedentarismo in Spanish, I guess.
But even but, right? But in context, that's pronounced very differently.
So to those of you who are following us, something that I like to do with my students whenever they encounter problems with one specific word and they want to say, hey, Leo, how do I pronounce this word? I said, well, I can't teach you how to pronounce this word. I can teach you how to recognize this word in different contexts. So how do we do this? I don't know how many of you are familiar with Youglish. It's an ugly name for a website, I have to say. But with Youglish, basically Youglish is basically a spoken corpus, or a spoken corpora, I should say, that you can actually use when you're dealing with pronunciation. So you type the word, and I'm going to show you very quickly how this works. I don't think I share the sound, so I'm going to have to stop sharing. Zoom is annoying with this sharing sound thing. Okay. So I'm going to play how this word is pronounced. See if you can hear the different ways the word sedentary is pronounced.
Best thing overall. We are not meant to be sedentary creatures. We haven't.
You blame it on sedentary behavior is one of the problems. It could be the vegetable oil.
Having a sedentary lifestyle, and that means that you're getting less than 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity.
If you're sedentary, before you go out for that walk.
So what's interesting here is this is the only time that the word sedentary is actually stressed, because it's given prominence. If you're sedentary, in the other ones, it was always an adjective, so the noun always took prominence there. Well, what's the trick there? What's the trick? Using the share menu. Oh, I didn't know that. See, I learned something new. Thanks, Danilo. Using the share, where is the share menu, man? I see. You see, man, you live and you learn. Anyway, so that's my reasoning for not teaching pronunciation at a word level. That's why I don't believe in YouTubers who teach, today I'm going to teach you how to pronounce the word bullshit. Or, you know, how to, like, I just don't see the value. I think language teaching should encourage autonomy. So what we really want our students to be able to do is, once they learn how to sound script, off they go, and they do it themselves. And I think that's how I see language learning. This is how I see language education. I don't want my students to be dependent on me to improve. I want to give them tools that would allow them to develop, in this case, their pronunciation skills, without me spending a lot of valuable classroom time teaching them the difference between sheep and ship. And I'm willing to die for my opinions, okay? It's okay. Somebody said, Leo, you have very strong opinions. They're supported. I try to support all my opinions. You don't have to agree with them. We can agree to disagree. But if you disagree, I would love to hear your take. If anyone has something to say about the way we approach pronunciation. I think the reason why, I don't remember if it was Celeste, or if it was Natalia, or if it was Fernanda, but somebody said it in the chat, because I can't really see the chat when I'm presenting, that we're not focusing on this. And I think I know the reason why is because CELTA courses don't teach us this. Most teacher education courses are still emphasizing word stress pronunciation, sentence pronunciation, stress, sentence level pronunciation, word level pronunciation, phrase level pronunciation. And published materials are still doing the same thing. And if most teachers teach from published materials and most teachers are taking these courses, this is exactly how they're going to be teaching. Natalia said, teachers are very phonologically unaware. Exactly. Exactly. I agree. I agree. It's true. It's true. It's a fact. I learned a lot more about pronunciation through Soundscripting than I have learned from reading How to Teach Pronunciation or other pronunciation books. My suggestion is give it a try. Start using it with your students. It's a framework. Once you learn it, we'll share the slides with the Soundscripting framework. I think we have a lesson that we've designed using Soundscripting, and you're more than welcome to have access to this lesson in our store, I think. But if anyone thinks differently, hey, this is an open space. This is not Twitter. You're allowed to disagree here.
But before we do that, I'll say we'll stop the recording, and before it gets too long, because my computer will take forever.
Nobody gets canceled here. Yeah, okay. I almost got canceled on Twitter the other day, but it's okay.
You missed out. Everyone's getting canceled. So.
Well, it was because there was a woman on